It is now time for our scripture reading. And my scripture today is taken from Acts chapter 27, verses 28 through 35. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and to the soldiers, "You will die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the sailors cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as the day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your head will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Thus ends the reading of our scripture, Acts chapter 27, verses 28 through 35. What is your anchor? Do you work through the storms of life? Or do you bail ship when the going gets tough? Life sure can throw us some curveballs. And most of us would prefer that it's always a bowl of cherries. But I'm going to be honest. Unfortunately, life isn't always Shangri-La. We experience adversity and challenges, but once we make it through them, once we get through to the other side, we find ourselves becoming stronger. Sometimes life is like being on the ship at sea, navigating choppy waters while facing the storms of life. Our initial reaction may be to do as the sailors did and to jump ship and find the safest and the quickest way out of the situation. It's that fight or flight gut reaction within us that kicks in. Do we see the storm through? Or do we abandon the ship and run away from our problems? Now, before we dive into our scripture lesson, I'm going to step back for a moment to put this into context. Metaphysically, the Bible and the people in the Bible represent aspects of us in our spiritual unfoldment. So, to better understand our scripture lesson today, it's helpful to learn what Paul, the commander, and the sailors represent in us. Before becoming a disciple, Paul was known as Saul. As Saul, his intent was to persecute Jesus and his teachings. And on the road to Damascus, Saul underwent a complete transformation. He went through the darkness into the light, and he was spiritually awakened. And once this awakening occurred, he became one of the most devoted disciples of Jesus and carried on his teachings. This transformation was so great that he changed his name from Saul to Paul. So what is a disciple? A disciple is a student. Just as Paul was a student, each of us are students. Paul represents our transformed, awakened spiritual consciousness. And the commander and the sailors, they represent aspects of our physical self. The commander is the overseer of the physical worker bees that we can think of as our thoughts and our emotions. In this scripture lesson, the sailors were concerned because even though they were anchored, their ship was drifting. They feared their boat would crash and hit the rocks. They didn't trust that the anchor would hold them through the night. Night or darkness, they represent the unknown, a lack of understanding. They were hoping to make it through to daylight. And what is daylight? Daylight is understanding. Lacking understanding and faith, the sailor's reaction was to choose flight, to abandon the ship by getting on a lifeboat and getting out of Dodge. And these sailors represent our human physical reaction. But Paul, our awakened spiritual self, said, hey, wait a minute. He told the commanding officer to take control of the physical, because if they didn't take control, they would die if the sailors left the ship. They were needed to help keep the ship safe and grounded. Our awakening spiritual nature can look at a situation and help to shine the light, to bring understanding where there is darkness. You see, if we are divided within ourselves, if our spiritual self is guiding us in one direction and our physical self is pulling us in another direction, we will become a house divided. And what do they say about a house divided? A house divided may fall. And we will struggle even more to make it through the storm. Sadly, we live in a world where so many are struggling mentally, emotionally, and with addiction. Life becomes overwhelming and they get lost. Some turn to drugs, alcohol, gambling, or whatever their vice may be to numb the pain, hoping it will calm the storm. But in many instances, these vices only make the storm last longer. Yeah, drugs and alcohol can numb the pain, but they also make the pendulum swing in more of a severe direction. Personally, I have experienced those dark nights of the soul, and I learned that drowning my sorrows in margaritas didn't make my problems go away. They made them worse. They made them worse because then I felt terrible in the morning and was even more depressed. They may temporarily delay our having to deal with our problems, but they don't go away. And I have learned that when this pendulum swings to the far, far left, eventually it's going to swing in an equal direction to the far, far right. And then it's hard to find our balance, to find that middle ground. It's hard to find our balance when it's bouncing back and forth from one extreme to the other. And it isn't until we become calm and quiet within ourselves that we find our balance. Stabilizing that pendulum, bringing it to that middle balance, and stopping the swing in severe extremes. And one way that we calm the storms is to lean into our spiritual self, to seek the light, to seek the understanding. By doing so, these periods of darkness will lessen, and we find ourselves finding the daylight sooner. Our spiritual self, in turn, will guide the commanding officer of our physical self. And the commanding officer can calm those fears and the emotions of the sailors. Our physical and spiritual nature work together. They work together in harmony toward the same goal, to move quickly out of the storm. Paul, or our spiritual self, he knew that everything was going to be okay. He told the sailors, "Not a hair on your heads will perish." Another tool to see us through is to find and trust our anchor. The sailors feared the anchors would not hold them in 90 feet of water and that they would crash on the rocks. They didn't trust their anchor. When we turn toward our awakened spiritual self, it is anchored to God. And with this knowledge, we know we can make it through any challenges. So we ask ourselves again, is our primary anchor God? Because when our primary anchor is God, we don't have to fear that we will drift against the rocks. God will shine the light on any situation to help us navigate our way through the storm. And centered in God, we tap into our inner strength and we find the courage to persevere. Rather than running away from our problems or turning to devices to numb our pain, we turn to God to help us work through the pain or the obstacles. We work through the challenges and we emerge even stronger. When we are anchored to and trust in God, it restores calm and balance to our thoughts and our emotions. And when we are calm, the commander and the sailors, they can think more clearly. They can think clearly to navigate a solution together and to hear the whispers of the soul. I have been working through the recent unexpected loss of my brother. I got to tell you, my world was rocked a couple of weeks ago. Life happens, but it's how we deal with it. When I'm going through trying times, I first rely on my anchor to God. And secondly, my support system, Reverend Jackson, family, friends, my church community, my work. For me, it's a combination of God as my spiritual anchor and my physical support system. And yes, I am giving myself the space and the grace to grieve. But I am grounded to facilitate my healing. When we turn to God in meditation, what happens? We begin the process of seeking the light. We begin the process of seeking understanding and a solution to the situation. When we can step outside of ourselves and get out of the center of the situation, we can see that bigger picture. We often say that with God, everything is in divine order. By first reminding ourselves, life is in divine order, then we look for the reason. Perhaps there's a lesson to be learned. Or perhaps it is something intended to make us stronger. And sometimes it's not even about us. We could be along for the ride and an instrument for someone else to help them learn their lesson. Soul growth. And slowly, the dawn breaks on the horizon. Understanding can help us see the big picture as we work through these obstacles. And it's not just about staying on the ship. It's also about striving to keep that ship steady on those smooth, calm, glassy waters and progressing to our destination, remaining calm and taking control of our thoughts and emotions, pausing to immerse ourselves in God, and opening our heart and mind in meditation, seeking guidance as to what is best for us. Our answers are not outside of us, and they're not in the world. Our answers are right within. My mother always had this saying in the toughest of times, but it was a good reminder. She said, Miss Pamela, if you don't learn the lesson, it's going to repeat itself. And boy, let me tell you, in those dark nights of the soul, I thought about what she said. And I thought, oh gosh, I can't keep going through this. I have got to figure this out because I got to get out of this storm. In our dark nights of the soul, or in the storms of life crashing down around us, when they happen, sometimes we want to run, but we've learned we can run, but we can't hide from our problems. Because if we don't learn, the storms will get even bigger. And the storms are the soul's way of getting our attention, saying, hey, you, listen to me. Pay attention. You need to course correct. You need to make some changes. Or it could be trying to get our attention so we learn the lesson. But when we turn to God to shine the light or the understanding on our problems and face the storm head on, we work through any situation quicker. And our seas or our thoughts will be calm for smooth sailing. Life has its challenges, but it also has its sweet moments. And by tasting the sour cherries, then we appreciate the sweetness of the plump, ripe, juicy fruit, bursting with sweetness. Yes, we are here to enjoy life, but we're also here to learn and to grow. When we are anchored to God, we need not fear. The daybreak will dawn sooner when our awakened spiritual self is at the helm, and by turning within to seek divine guidance. Our spiritual and physical aspects working together in harmony to find the solution, calming our thoughts and emotions so we can hear with our heart and with our mind, grounded and anchored to God, allowing the Paul in us to guide us, and working with our commander to restore balance and peace. Blessings to each of you this day. Namaste.